On April 30, 2010, residents of Zhao Zuo village, located in the Henan province city of Shangqiu, saw a ghost. Villager Zhao Zhenshang returned to his hometown for the first time in 13 years, much to the shock of other residents of the village, as he was supposed to be long dead. As far as the people in the village were concerned, his headless corpse had been found hidden down the bottom of a dry well in the May of 1999, his homicide already having been investigated and solved. Fellow villager Zhao Zuo Hai had been arrested, charged, tried and convicted for the homicide of Zhao Zhenshang, and had been serving his sentence for the past 11 years. The return of Zhao Zhenshang would expose a massive miscarriage of justice, which almost cost an innocent man his life for a crime that never took place. On the 8th of May 1999, residents of Zhao Zuo village were doing maintenance work on a dry well on the outskirts of the village. Looking down to the bottom of the well, they noticed a large piece of stone that looked like it had been purposely placed there, which could potentially cause a blockage, preventing the well from properly dispersing water. A couple of the villagers went down into the well to deal with the issue. However, under the stone they were greeted with the shocking sight of remains of a headless body, whose legs below the knees were also missing. Police were called to investigate, but the men who'd been working on the well had all come to the same conclusion: the body must have belonged to Zhao Zhenshang. On February 15, 1998, a nephew of Zhao Zhenshang went to the local police to report his uncle was missing. The nephew told police his uncle disappeared on the 30th of October 1997, and no one had seen or heard from him since. The nephew was sure that his uncle had his life ended by another villager, naming Zhao Zuo Hai, as the two men had recently been in conflict with each other. After the nephew's report, police began looking into the apparent disappearance of Zhao Zhenshang. They questioned Zhao Zuo Hai, finding that he had a notable injury to his head and marks on his arms which had recently healed. Zhao Zuo Hai claimed he received them in the process of helping another villager renovate their home. He also went on to admit that he and Zhao Zhenshang, who'd previously been friends, had a falling out over a monetary dispute. But at the time there was no body and no evidence that a crime had even taken place, so the investigation didn't go much further, with Zhao Zhenshang simply being put down as a missing person. Now in 1999, with a headless body being found close to the village, the investigation was reopened, the first point of action being to try and identify the remains. The dry well was excavated, the remains removed and sent off to be examined, while the entire area was searched for any other forensic evidence. While DNA testing wasn't widely available in the country, the local judiciary decided to use the Physical Evidence Identification Department of the Ministry of Public Security to help. Zhao Zhenshang was unmarried, had no children, his parents died years earlier, and he had no siblings or close family. The decision was made to go to his family tomb and take DNA samples from the skeletal remains of his mother. However, the results would come back as inconclusive, the samples provided unable to give enough information to offer a clear answer to the identity of the victim. But having a body in Zhao Zhenshang being the only person in the village having disappeared without trace, along with the nephew and other villagers making accusations against Zhao Zuo Hai, the police decided to interview him once more in connection to the body. Zhao Zuo Hai was arrested and made an official suspect the day after the discovery of the remains, and between May 10 and June 18 of 1999 made 9 different confessions, taking responsibility for the intentional homicide of Zhao Zhenshang. According to his final confession, the conflict between the two men came to a head over a woman in the village. The woman in question was identified as Du Jinhui. She wasn't native to the village, coming from Gansu province, 1,300 kilometers to the west. A rumor swirled around the village that she'd been bought by her husband for the purposes of marriage and to produce children, a claim she'd later refute. The truth was that she was introduced to her future husband, himself native to Zhao Zuo, while he was working in Gansu, in the city of Lanzhou. After the couple married in Shangqiu, she stayed in the village with their first child, while her husband went back to working in Lanzhou. Her new home was less than 100 meters from the homes of both Zhao Zuo Hai and Zhao Zhenshang. When questioning villagers about the relationship between Zhao Zuo Hai and Zhao Zhenshang, there were rumors of the then 26-year-old Du Jihui having an affair with both the married Zhao Zuo Hai and the unmarried Zhao Zhenshang, who were both over 40. In his final confession, Zhao Zuo Hai stated that on the evening of October 30, 1997, he was with Du Jihui engaging in intimate activity. Zhao Zhenshang walked in on the pair and, angered at the sight that greeted him, attacked Zhao Zuo Hai with a knife, causing cuts to the head and arms of his love rival. Zhao Zhenshang then left the room with the injured Zhao Zuo Hai, also arming himself with a knife, in pursuit. Fearing his former friend would expose the infidelity to his wife, Zhao Zuo Hai attacked Zhao Zhenshang, ending his life, then headed to his own home. Once home, and covered in the blood of his victim, he informed his wife he'd done something shameful, but told her not to ask any questions. Seeing the injuries to his head and arms, she told him to go to a hospital, but he refused and waited until his wife went to sleep. As his wife slept, he returned to the home of Zhao Zhenshang and got on with the process of disposing of the body, first removing the head and then the legs below the knees. He placed the body into a bag and took it to the dry well on a cart, dumping it down the hole, before dropping the piece of stone on top of it to obscure the body from view. Returning to the home of his victim, he then burned the head along with the amputated limbs, made an attempt to hide bloodstains under soil, and returned to his own home. The following morning, he went to the local medical clinic, getting some medicinal treatment for his cuts, and later burned the clothes stained by his victim's blood in the courtyard of his own home. His wife would confirm many elements of the confession her husband gave, and it was seemingly an open and shut case. The investigation was passed on to the Shangqiu prosecution office, but looking over the case files, prosecutors told police there were too many points of contention, despite the confession. Firstly, the body in the well had yet to have its identity confirmed. There had now been 4 attempts which all failed to provide a conclusive answer. There were no witnesses to the actual crime, and no weapon found. Especially questionable was the point that forensic examination of the remains estimated that the victim was 1.70 meters tall, while Zhao Zhenshang was said to be around only 1.65 meters. The judiciary ordered police to carry out further investigations and offer some solid evidence that could support the submitted confession from Zhao Zuo Hai. Unable to find any new evidence, investigators detained Du Jihui and the wife of Zhao Zuo Hai, who eventually admitted Zhao Zuo Hai confessed his guilt to them. Police would submit the case to the prosecutor's office twice more, but still it would be rejected due to the lack of actual evidence. By now Zhao Zuo Hai had been held in detention without officially being charged for over 1,000 days. Eventually, with pressure coming from the provincial prosecutor's office to clear up outstanding cases, investigators found a judge willing to prosecute the case after looking over the confession, going ahead with the trial despite the lack of evidence that the crime had even occurred. Slightly over 3 years after being arrested, Zhao Zuo Hai faced trial for intentional homicide. Unable to afford a lawyer, he was appointed a defense attorney by the court. However, the man chosen to defend him was still a trainee and had yet to achieve a license to practice law. On November 11, 2002, the trial began and would last 20 days. During the proceedings, Zhao Zuo Hai retracted his confession, claiming police had physically abused him to confess and forced him to change what he said several times. The lead judge dismissed his claim, arguing it was unreasonable to believe that his confession was gained through coercion, since the statements from his wife and Du Jihui fully supported the confession's details. On the 5th of December 2002, Zhao Zuo Hai was found guilty of intentional homicide and handed the death penalty, although it would come with a 2-year suspension. He made no attempt to appeal the verdict, and was 47 years old at the time of his conviction. Being a middle-aged man who'd never been in trouble with the law before, he was unaware he could appeal the verdict, and the trainee lawyer didn't inform him it was possible. Some members of his family did look into the possibility, but the farmers from a poor village lacked both the knowledge and money to go about it. As the 2-year suspension of his death sentence neared, a review of the case, combined with the good behavior and performance of Zhao Zuo Hai while incarcerated, the punishment was commuted to life in prison, with the possibility of being released after serving a minimum of 20 years. But then in 2010, 8 years after the conviction of Zhao Zuo Hai, a dead man walked into the village.
我问了赵总家跟哪里住，我这边我是，你也不听你死了，对你赵总好像还杀死了，我说这哪死了？没死了，这不是别人嘛？咋死了？那归我梦话，死了见鬼我自害了见，咋别见？
To say the residents of Zhaolu village were surprised was an understatement, and there was a significant amount of disbelief that he was actually the person he claimed to be. But after meeting with the village committee and presenting his ID card along with a scar on his stomach from a childhood surgical procedure, there was little doubt that Zhao Zhenshang had returned from the dead. Once the identity of Zhao Zhenshang was confirmed beyond question, things moved with uncharacteristic speed. The Shangqiu judiciary petitioned to revoke the criminal conviction against Zhao Zuo Hai, and local government officials made the trip to Henan prison in Kaifeng City. 11 years after originally being held in detention, and then being jailed, Zhao Zuo Hai was told he was a free man. After being informed his supposed victim had suddenly returned to the village, Zhao Zuo Hai stood for a moment in stunned silence, before breaking down in tears as he was told his conviction was going to be immediately overturned. There was then a brief hearing where he was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. He signed his acquittal papers before being told he was going to be immediately transported back home to Zhaolu village, a free man. He broke down in tears once more as police led him out of the room to where his family were waiting. His sister, eldest son and other family members, most of whom he'd not seen for many years, had been brought to the prison to greet him. As Zhao Zuo Hai was walking out the front door of the prison, the media there to capture the moment, an investigation into the massive miscarriage of justice was already underway. There were 3 major points to clear up. First, what caused Zhao Zuo Hai to confess to the homicide. Second, how such an obviously weak case against him went ahead. And third, who the body found in the dry well belonged to. Returning to the village at night, his mind still trying to make sense of the events that had taken place over the last few hours, Zhao Zuo Hai was greeted by the local and national media, who had already picked up the story and were clamoring to speak with him and Zhao Zhenshang.
我这打工的钱，他一直不给我，他说叫我去要，结果是他借，所以他借来，真是结果谁借谁要钱，我这是难为我。我花了路费，我花100块钱路费，我也没要到，我就享受。
Not long after his apparent resurrection and return to the village, Zhao Zhenshang had already given interviews to the media, explaining the reasons for his sudden disappearance. The 2 men had grown-up childhood friends, and at one point left the village together for 2 years, to work in the Shanxi province city Yan'an. Zhao Zuo Hai found the job doing construction work around the area through an agent who was responsible for paying them. Zhao Zhenshang believed Zhao Zuo Hai cheated him out of 2,000 yuan, about $240 USD once they were paid, but Zhao Zuo Hai argued that it was the agent who'd held the money back, so it wasn't his fault. Zhao Zhenshang further claimed their relationship would finally come to an end when Du Jinhui moved into the village and became their neighbor. Zhao Zhenshang quickly set his sights on the married mother, who was almost half his age. However, he began to believe Zhao Zuo Hai, who was married with children, also had designs on the younger woman. Other villagers noticed Zhao Zuo Hai spending time around Du Jinhui, and gossip about the relationship between them spread around the village, which only further convinced Zhao Zhenshang that Zhao Zuo Hai was getting in his way. Seeing Zhao Zuo Hai enter the home of Du Jinhui on the evening of October 30th, 1997, Zhao Zhenshang was enraged and entered the home himself, armed with a knife.
我这样我打过了，我别让我揍我了，我喝了我打的。
喝了你咋打他呢？
打刀头部劈到。
He slashed at Zhao Zuo Hai numerous times, causing deep cuts to the head and arms of his former friend, then quickly fled back to his own home. However, he became concerned that Zhao Zuo Hai would come looking for revenge, and scared of the possibility, he decided to leave the village. He grabbed some of his belongings, his savings of only 400 yuan, a little under 50 USD, and left the village on his tricycle, riding off in the night without a word to anyone. He spent the next years of his life drifting around various cities in the provinces of Anhui, Shanxi and Hunan, among others, struggling to get by, taking on very low-paid menial work where he could find it. In the weeks after he left, few people took notice of the fact Zhao Zhenshang was gone, most just assuming he'd left the area looking for work. But as weeks turned into months, rumors and more village gossip caused villagers to make different assumptions. After 4 months passed, with Zhao Zhenshang not contacting anyone over that period of time, the missing person report was made. The nephew making sure to tell police his own suspicions about Zhao Zuo Hai, including the conflict over money between the two men and the rumored love triangle. When police spoke to him shortly after the missing person report was made, Zhao Zuo Hai made a mistake. Still showing the scars from Zhao Zhenshang attacking him with a knife, knowing it looked bad, he lied about how he received them, something the police wouldn't forget. Once the body was found a year later, with police and villagers assuming it belonged to Zhao Zhenshang, investigators only had one suspect in mind. At the start, police genuinely felt Zhao Zuo Hai was guilty. They took the gossip which the majority of the village told them as fact, and they knew he lied about the injuries he'd received.
那个墙早已就得歪，你就我没啥，你有啥办法？你有办法？就说你是个那反正说，就说你杀人了，别打我你杀人了，你说你没啥，你是有啥的？你自己。
But Zhao Zuo Hai maintained his innocence, increasingly frustrating the officers interrogating him. Determined to get a confession to what police believed Zhao Zuo Hai was guilty of, the beatings started. It began with punches and kicks to the body and head, but when that couldn't get him to confess, police graduated to using batons. Still maintaining his innocence, he'd be pistol-whipped, and the brutal interrogation added psychological abuse to the physical. While he was blindfolded, the barrels of firearms were placed against his head or in his mouth. Officers then set off firecrackers to mimic the sound of the weapon being fired, leading Zhao Zuo Hai to believe he'd been shot. He was refused food, deprived of sleep, forced into stress positions for hours at a time, and not allowed to use a bathroom.
打我一个个，没办法的我的，行了，你不夸张了，一早那往一起来普通的普通的，还有多的有这两户的，这是老这个后边上，这是老后边上，我不知道我都看这说那时候都受不了了，我就说，你要承认看到，没有我就乱吵了，我全没你算。
Whenever the interrogators went too far, and caused significant injuries, the police doctor would be brought in to treat wounds and stitch up cuts. However, once he was considered sufficiently recovered, he was taken back to the interrogation room for another round of questions. When he still refused to confess, police told him that they could easily end his life, and just tell other people he'd managed to run away. Zhao Zuo Hai, knowing that if he confessed he was facing the death penalty anyway, continued to resist the pressure and fought for his life. But the interrogators didn't let up. They would start mixing some kind of medication with boiling water, forcibly making him drink it, scalding his mouth and throat. He had no idea what the medication he was being forced to consume was, but after drinking it he felt as if he was unable to stand up and could barely move. Eventually, it became too much, and Zhao Zuo Hai reached breaking point, finally agreeing to confess. At first, police allowed him to tell them what happened in his own words, but since he hadn't done anything, he just made up stories, constantly getting things wrong. He was unaware the victim's head and legs below the knees had been removed, or of where the body had been hidden, telling police he dumped it in the river or woods surrounding the village. Each time he got something wrong, his interrogators told him he was lying and subjected him to more beatings. Initially, the officers, still convinced of his guilt, believed he was just trying to fool them, but as more confessions that failed to match what little evidence they had were given, the realization hit them that they had the wrong man. But things had gone too far and they needed a confession, so they began telling Zhao Zuo Hai what he did, getting him to agree as they wrote the statement. The dictated confession was put to the judiciary of Shangqiu, but with forensic examination of the body unable to identify if it belonged to Zhao Zhenshang, the investigators were told they needed more evidence to support the statement. Knowing they weren't going to find any evidence, the police had to explore other avenues. Investigators needed other people to say Zhao Zuo Hai told them what he'd done, and were prepared to do anything to get that. Unwittingly, the wife of Zhao Zuo Hai had already solidified the idea that her husband was guilty in the minds of the police. When she was initially questioned, she told them that her husband came home that night with a number of cuts to his arm and head. She asked him what happened, but Zhao Zuo Hai, realizing it made him look bad saying he was attacked whilst in the home of Du Jinhui, didn't go into detail, only telling her Zhao Zhenshang attacked him, and to just forget about it. His being secretive about the assault led police to believe the rumors of the affair with Du Jinhui were true, and he was trying to hide it from his wife, giving him a motive. Now needing evidence to support the confession of Zhao Zuo Hai, police arrested his wife, and she received similar treatment to her husband. She was detained for a month, police telling her to admit her husband told her he ended the life of Zhao Zhenshang, but she refused, in efforts to help him. As in the case of her husband, it didn't take long for the abuse to begin. She was beaten with batons, placed into stress positions for extended periods of time, deprived of sleep for days, and starved. Unable to endure the interrogation tactics employed by the police, she agreed to say whatever they wanted. They demanded she say her husband came home that night after getting into a fight with Zhao Zhenshang, and told her he ended the man's life, and how he disposed of the body. The other woman involved in the case, Du Jinhui, also initially refused to go along with the police's version of events, but received similar treatment until she changed her story to fit the narrative. She told police about the fight between the two men, but was then forced to say she had an intimate relationship with them both, and that Zhao Zuo Hai told her he'd ended the life of Zhao Zhenshang.
那当时他这个派出所的人是用什么打的你？
汽车拐的。
对不起，
就那儿嘞，靠来那个棍呢，
棍子。
4楼那棍呢。
4楼有这个刺儿的棍子。
With statements from villagers believing Zhao Zuo Hai was guilty, his own confession and the supporting statements from his wife and Du Jinhui, police once again went back to the prosecutor's office to get the case tried. By now, Zhao Zuo Hai had been detained and interrogated for over 1,000 days. However, judges still refused to try the case, until pressure came from above to clear up unresolved investigations. Police forces and law offices were financially incentivized to have good criminal case clearance rates. They would receive more funding from the government, with individuals getting large bonuses for the work. With the possibility of receiving significant financial rewards for the conviction, a judge eventually decided to try Zhao Zuo Hai.
后来就跑题这几年，有没有听说赵子海被抓到这儿了？
没听说。因为一直没见他在哪里开始。
In his time away from Zhaolou, Zhao Zhenshang never contacted anyone from the village, and claimed he had no idea Zhao Zuo Hai had been convicted of his homicide. He struggled to get by, drifting aimlessly around the country, only able to find low-paying work, and living in the cheapest accommodation available. When police looked into past records of his identity card being registered, they found only 2 occasions in the 13 years he was away. Once was when he checked into a hotel in the city of Zhoukou, 130 kilometers to the southwest of Shangqiu, and a second time during the SARS epidemic of 2003, when he checked into a hotel in Zhuzhou in Hunan province. On neither occasion did his ID card inform people that he was supposed to be deceased. In 2009, the health of Zhao Zhenshang declined rapidly. He began suffering from hemiplegia, experiencing muscle weakness, which eventually developed into partial paralysis of the limbs on the left side of his body. With him now struggling to take care of himself, and not having the ability to make any money, he had little choice but to return to Zhaolou, so he could claim government welfare, and hope the few relatives he had in the village were still around to take care of him. His remaining family truly believed his body had been found at the bottom of the well, and that Zhao Zuo Hai had been the one to end his life. The return received significant attention from the media once news of it spread, and he gave his side of the story in several interviews. He was asked if he felt any guilt for his former friend being jailed for his supposed homicide. But he told reporters his conscience was clear, and lamented the fact he felt he'd also lost part of his life. Gradually he tired of the attention his return generated, and refused to give further interviews. He isolated himself from others in the village who also had questions for him, and eventually he stopped talking to anyone. The media and villagers soon lost interest in Zhao Zhenshang when Zhao Zuo Hai returned. The residents of Zhaolou village, once convinced he'd ended the life of his friend, and happily told that to the police, came out to welcome him home. However, for Zhao Zuo Hai, things in the village had changed dramatically over the years he'd spent incarcerated. After his conviction and believing he was going to be executed, his wife left the village with their two youngest children. She went on to start a relationship with another man, considering him her new husband. With it being unoccupied, his family home had been allowed to fall into ruin, others in the village helping themselves to items left behind, and using his farmland for themselves. As a result, on his return he had to move into his sister's home and live with her family, as the media flocked to the village hungry for interviews. In the weeks after his release, Zhao Zuo Hai made numerous appearances in the national media, and found himself unwittingly becoming something of a celebrity across the country. He talked openly of his abuse at the hands of his interrogators, and his experience in prison. At times the attention became overwhelming for the man now pushing 60 years of age. While Zhao Zuo Hai detailed his brutal experience with police, exposing the shocking miscarriage of justice, both the Public Security Bureau and Prosecutor's Office in Shangqiu also had questions to answer. Once the news broke, a team was set up to investigate the case, and set about tracking down the police officers involved in the abuse of Zhao Zuo Hai, all of whom were still serving officers, and most of whom had moved on to more senior positions. 2 were arrested relatively quickly, but others, once they heard of the return of Zhao Zhenshang, left the area. Eventually 6 police officers were arrested. They were Luo Mingzhu and Wang Songlin, who served as captain and deputy captain of the local Public Security Bureau, and had pressured other officers to get the confession from Zhao Zuo Hai. The 3rd officer arrested was Ding Zhongqiu, who previously served as the deputy director of the Criminal Investigation Bureau. The 4th man tracked down was Si Chongxing, who was deputy captain of the Criminal Investigation Bureau at the time, but was now deputy captain of the Economic Crimes Bureau. The final 2 men were Zhou Minghan and Guo Shouhai, who were both still serving rank-and-file police officers who hadn't made much progress with their careers. The judges involved in the conviction were also investigated. Those still serving in the courts were suspended and detained, while investigations into their conduct and decisions were opened. While these investigations were taking place, the higher-level provincial police were looking into the other major issue in the case, namely the identity of the body in the well. The only person who went missing from the village at the time was Zhao Zhenshang, so the net was cast wider to neighboring villages, police investigating any names of people reported missing from the county around that time. The new investigation team visited the families of the missing persons and took blood samples to test against DNA samples taken from the remains. Soon enough they had a match and came up with the name Gaozongzhi, from Shizihe, a village just 17 kilometers to the south of Zhaolou. Police then discovered that 3 men living in surrounding villages suddenly left their homes shortly after the news of Zhao Zuo Hai being released began making national headlines in the media. The three men were Li Haijin, who lived in Yinlou village, just under 2 kilometers from Zhaolou, and Yang Mingfu in Zhangxiangliang, both from the village Zhangzhuang, which neighbored the victim's hometown. At least one of the men had a prior business relationship with the victim, so police set about hunting the three men down as suspects in connection with the death of Gao Zongzhi. On May 14, 2010, police managed to first arrest Yang Mingfu, who hadn't run far, finding him in a Shangqiu hotel, in which he'd used his ID card to register his stay. The other two men got much further, but not far enough. Li Haijin was arrested on May 22, 600 kilometers to the northeast, in the city of Tianjin. Again, he was found after using his identity card to register at a hotel. The third wanted man got even further. However, 2 days later on May 24, Zhang Xiangliang was tracked down and taken into custody by police in Shenyang, a city in the northeastern province Liaoning, 1,200 kilometers from Shangqiu. The three men were detained by police in Shangqiu and confessed to taking part in the intentional homicide of Gao Zongzhi. Li Haijin and the victim Gao Zongzhi were doing business together in Heze, a city 100 kilometers to the north of Shangqiu. They were selling mooncakes, the traditional Chinese snack largely eaten during China's Mid-Autumn Festival. The two men fell out over the business, predictably about the share of the profits, with Li Haijin deciding he needed to end his business partner's life once they returned to their hometown villages in Shangqiu. Almost 1 year after the disappearance of Zhao Zhenshang, the three men met with Gao Zongzhi on the 12th of September, 1998. They were joined by a fourth man, Liu Yuanxi, who was later executed in 2006 for taking part in a separate homicide. The quartet beat Gao Zongzhi to death, removing the victim's head to prevent the body from being easily identified, and the legs below the knees to make it easier to dump down the well. They then transported the body to the dry well on the edge of Zhaolou village, disposing of it down the hole and trying to hide it by dropping the stone on top of it. Any worries they had about being arrested for the incident were soon washed away when the news about Zhao Zuo Hai being accused of their crime spread. Once they heard that Zhao Zhenshang returned to the village and Zhao Zuo Hai was released from prison, they realized there would be an investigation into the identity of the body, so attempted to go into hiding. In the November of 2011, the three living suspects went on trial for the intentional homicide of Gao Zongzhi. Ringleader Li Haijin attempted to place the blame on the already executed accomplice Liu Yuanxi, claiming that he personally played no direct part in the beating which ended the life of Gao Zongzhi, and that Liu Yuanxi was the person responsible. However, he'd soon discover there was no honor among thieves, and that Yang Mingfu and Zhang Xiangliang had both confessed that all four of them had beaten the victim to death, and made it clear it was planned by Li Haijin. They were hoping that the honesty in their confessions would see them receive lighter sentences. And that's what they got. Li Haijin was sentenced to death for intentional homicide, while Yang Mingfu and Zhang Xiangliang were both handed light sentences, with the possibility of the punishments being reduced if they performed well while incarcerated. Fully exonerated, Zhao Zuo Hai could now focus on rebuilding his life, and the compensation he was going to receive from the government was supposed to help him do just that. He had lost more than just 11 years of his life. His wife left him, taking his daughter and youngest son, who was only 6 years old when Zhao Zuo Hai was imprisoned. Only his oldest son chose to stay in the village with his aunt. His home was uninhabitable, and his farmland had largely been appropriated by others in the village. Zhao Zuo Hai and the family asked for 1.5 million yuan, around 180,000 USD, but the local government felt it was unwise to give such a large amount in a single payment, so they'd compensate him in a variety of ways. His wrongful conviction would see him awarded 650,000 yuan, a little under 80,000 USD. This amount was based on the average daily wage of state employees in the region for the period of time Zhao Zuo Hai spent incarcerated. As part of his compensation package, his old home would be demolished, and a new property built which would come with a larger area of farmland. Furthermore, the local government ordered the construction of another 4 properties in the village under the name of Zhao Zuo Hai, which he would bequeath to his children, along with the extra land that came with the homes. He'd receive other benefits, such as money being placed into his state pension, and free medical care. His experience also gave him the opportunity to take a citizen agent position. Citizen agents are people who mediate generally minor civil disputes between parties, usually attempting to get the people involved to come to an agreement without the need of going to court. They are more prevalent in small rural communities, where the people lack the finances to afford professional lawyers. As in the case of Zhao Zuo Hai, citizen agents rarely have formal legal knowledge, and are usually people who have standing in the community. But taking on this role would have unintended consequences for Zhao Zuo Hai. The Zhao Zuo Hai case came only 5 years after an eerily similar incident in Hubei province. In what will be a future video, a man named She Xianglin was suspected of the intentional homicide of his wife, despite her body never being found. In 1998, he was sentenced to death for the crime, but the conviction was overturned when his supposedly deceased wife returned home. He would be acquitted in 2005, and the story he told of his treatment while being detained and interrogated mirrored that of Zhao Zuo Hai, despite the fact he was a police officer himself at the time of the case. The incident was still fairly fresh in people's minds when the truth about the case of Zhao Zuo Hai spread. As a result, he'd make numerous appearances on national television broadcasts, detailing his experiences, becoming a highly recognizable face across China.
我管几百人呢，我可能还管了几百人呢。可能我管几百人，反正就是，可能这个说的那个不沾，那就干部就是说你不沾。一般情况我都不愿意说谁不沾。我过去以后呢，咱说我了，那这些人我犯人我也都看有的害怕，人都害怕了我会跟说你不要怕，我不会那个。
In the various interviews he gave, he talked about his time as a prisoner, his feelings towards Zhao Zhenshang, and the impact his conviction had on his family. He'd say that he was treated fairly well in prison. Due to his age and health issues, he was placed in charge of the prison's garment production workshop, which gave him certain privileges, and actually enjoyed being a boss. He understood his wife's decision to leave the village and start a new family, bearing no ill feelings towards her, as she was doing what she thought was best for their children, and saying he'd make their divorce official. When talking about Zhao Zhenshang, he said there was no point hating him, what was done, and being angry about it would do nothing to change what happened in the past.
那你为啥这几年你一直都不上诉呢？
我一直不上诉，别来路上我年纪大了，那个干活又说那个了，也不是说多重。我想想跟谁说了，咱也不惹，年纪大了也不惹事，减刑。 那是看档案发出来很热乎吧？减刑，我可以就回去了，家里也没人了，我家里也没有人了。
Asked if he ever thought about appealing or fighting against his conviction, he explained once he'd found out he could from other prisoners, he felt he was too old and didn't want the trouble. He also feared that the police would likely beat him again to keep him quiet. In June 2012, the investigations into the actions of the police and judges involved in the case came to a close. It was concluded that the case should never have gone to trial, even with the confessions of Zhao Zuo Hai, his wife, and Du Jihui. If Zhao Zuo Hai had been appointed qualified, competent legal representation, the case would have been dismissed before a trial went ahead. People suspected of a crime could only be legally held without charge for 602 days. But Zhao Zuo Hai had been detained for just over 1,000, which should have seen his supposed confession inadmissible. However, the unqualified trainee lawyer he was appointed could do little to mount a professional defense. The judges who sentenced Zhao Zuo Hai would be fined and banned from ever holding a state position again, but weren't criminally punished, as they successfully argued they were simply responding to the police investigation. The police officers who beat the confession out of Zhao Zuo Hai would be criminally prosecuted for their actions. The 6 officers were all found guilty of extracting a confession through torture, and would receive prison sentences, apart from one who was exempted from being imprisoned due to serious health issues. The sentences given out, however, were almost laughably lenient given the length of time Zhao Zuo Hai was unjustly incarcerated, with 5 of the men only having to serve 2 years in prison. They would also be heavily fined, barred from ever holding a state position again, and lose all benefits state employees were normally entitled to. Despite the light sentences, the officers appealed the decision, but the appeals were rejected. The life of Zhao Zuo Hai as a free man began well enough, with his new home, compensation payment, returned land, and the homes for his family members. More good news quickly followed. His release from prison happened in time to allow him to attend his eldest son's wedding, and he was able to gift the happy couple one of the homes that was being built as part of his compensation package. Despite the village being small, Zhao Zuo Hai and Zhao Zhenshang stayed out of each other's way. Even if there was any bad blood remaining, they were both too old to do anything about it. With him now being a local celebrity, many people in disputes came to see Zhao Zuo Hai in his citizen agent role, and while performing his duties, a new woman entered his life. Li Sulan was attempting to divorce her husband, something which the man didn't want. She came to Zhao Zuo Hai and told him her story, asking him to help mediate the dispute between her and her husband. He managed to help her get what she wanted, but in meeting Li Sulan, the life of Zhao Zuo Hai soon saw a dramatic change, and not for the better. Li Sulan, who was twice divorced already, was now on her 3rd. Like many people around the country, she'd seen the story of Zhao Zuo Hai, and claimed she wanted him to mediate her divorce, as she was touched by the injustice he'd experienced. Not long after meeting, the two began seeing each other and announced their intention to marry once her current marriage was over. This was despite Zhao Zuo Hai still being officially married. The media following the story of Zhao Zuo Hai since his acquittal announced the news he intended to marry Li Sulan, which would bring his current wife back to the village for the first time in many years. Having started a new family, she was prepared to agree to the divorce, but felt she was also due some of the compensation. He'd sign over 2 of the properties built for him to his wife, with the expectation they'd later go to his 2 youngest children, whom he hadn't seen since he was imprisoned and his wife left the village with them. With that, his wife agreed to the divorce, leaving Zhao Zuo Hai free to marry Li Sulan. However, his citizen agent days came to an end. While the position wasn't official, there were still rules and expectations of professional ethics, starting relationships with clients being forbidden, and so the agency was shut down. Zhao Zuo Hai had enjoyed the work helping people, but at heart he was a simple man who was happy to return to the life farming his land. However, Li Sulan appeared to enjoy a more cosmopolitan lifestyle. She liked to dress in a manner which she considered fashionable, and was rarely seen around the village without her sunglasses and expensive-looking jewelry. The new daughter-in-law of Zhao Zuo Hai was somewhat suspicious about the motivations of her husband's new mother-in-law, and the pair would have a confrontational relationship. She made no attempt to hide her belief that Li Sulan was only interested in Zhao Zuo Hai for his money. But despite the very vocal misgivings of his daughter-in-law, Zhao Zuo Hai eventually married Li Sulan. Unfortunately, the happiness he felt after getting married soon dissipated, as vultures began circling around him. His 650,000 yuan compensation had been widely reported in the media and was common knowledge around the village. It had made him probably the wealthiest man in Zhaolou, and people soon wanted a taste of his perceived good fortune. After his release from prison, with his home being in ruins, he lived in his sister's home. Once he moved out, his brother-in-law asked for 20,000 yuan, around 2,400 USD, as rent for his time staying with them. Zhao Zuo Hai felt the amount being asked was too much, and offered a payment of 5,000 yuan, which his brother-in-law considered cheap, and he refused to speak with Zhao Zuo Hai after that. There was then a falling out with his uncle, again over money. When Zhao Zhenshang returned to the village, the uncle reported it to the village committee, and felt Zhao Zuo Hai should reward him. He demanded 50,000 yuan, 6,000 USD for being the first to report it. Again, Zhao Zuo Hai felt the amount was too much, and offered 3,000 instead. Just as with the brother-in-law, the uncle felt insulted by the amount being offered to him, feeling entitled to much more, and the two wouldn't speak again. The villagers who once were quick to tell police they believed Zhao Zuo Hai ended the life of Zhao Zhenshang, then welcomed him back with open arms, began looking for handouts. When he refused, people turned against him. In their eyes he was wealthy, so should have no problem giving people money, since he could easily afford it. Zhao Zuo Hai believed the people who were asking for loans from him had no intention to pay back the money they were asking for, and didn't want to see his money just dwindle away. Villagers quickly became resentful towards him, bad-mouthing him to each other, calling him stingy, and 铁公鸡, meaning iron rooster, an old derogatory term meaning miser. Things would get even worse when the one person who thus far had remained close to him, his eldest son, did something Zhao Zuo Hai believed was a betrayal. The son took his father's banking passbook and removed 140,000 yuan, almost 17,000 USD from his father's account and placed it into his own. Zhao Zuo Hai failed to notice the money had been taken for several weeks, but when he did, he confronted his son about the apparent theft. His son claimed he'd taken the money to protect it. Like his wife, he'd become skeptical about the motives of his father's new wife. He explained that he took the money to ensure his father had something left, in case Li Sulan conned him into giving it to her. Annoyed that his son didn't trust Li Sulan, and feeling the act of taking the money was unforgivable, their relationship broke down. Zhao Zuo Hai told his son to keep the money, and use it to take care of any future grandchildren. With family members no longer speaking to him, and other villagers bad-mouthing him and Li Sulan behind his back, he decided that it was time to leave the village, opening a small guest house in Shangqiu on the advice of Li Sulan. After the incident with his son, believing that as someone who'd never had much money before he wasn't able to properly take care of his own finances, he allowed Li Sulan to manage the money. Since neither of them had experience of running a guest house, it quickly closed down, losing them 40,000 yuan, almost 5,000 USD in the process. But this would be a small loss compared to the next business venture she proposed. In 2011, the couple traveled to the special autonomous region Ningxia to meet a businessman with whom Li Sulan had been in contact. The businessman was supposedly looking for investors for a large development project in the region. He claimed that for an investment of 175,000 yuan, just over 20,000 USD, the couple could see returns of over 3 million yuan. Li Sulan was so confident in the project, she also convinced her own daughters to invest their life savings into the scheme. Given his minor celebrity status, his presence was noticed by the media in Ningxia, and a reporter came to interview him. Zhao Zuo Hai told the journalist about the investment he was making, but the skeptical reporter suggested that it was very likely a scam. Li Sulan reacted angrily to the suggestion, and told the reporter to leave them alone. Predictably, the reporter was proven to be correct when the supposed businessman disappeared with the money, revealing the project never existed. Zhao Zuo Hai decided he wasn't going to risk any more major investments, believing that it was best to leave the remaining money in the bank, living a simple life off the interest it generated. During his time in prison, China had changed dramatically, and the former farmer felt he was 11 years behind the rest of society, and struggled to adjust to the new China he was now trying to navigate, especially in a city. He felt it was better to return to the village, despite people there turning their backs on him, but Li Sulan was against the idea. She believed she wouldn't be welcome there, largely due to the conflict between her and the daughter-in-law of Zhao Zuo Hai. The disagreement between them got to such a point that Zhao Zuo Hai felt the relationship had no future. Such was the interest in his life at the time. The couple were invited on television to debate the issues between them. Many of his appearances on television were paid for, so while they were publicly exposing issues in their private lives, it was a way for them to at least earn some of the money they'd lost back. They eventually decided to stay in the city, but more problems would be right around the corner. Li Sulan would once again be contacted by a businessman promising he could make them rich. This time the businessman claimed to be the head of a wealth management fund, and told them he could help accrue greater interest on their money, promising 8,000 yuan, just under 1,000 USD a month, much more than if the money was just sitting in a bank account. Zhao Zuo Hai was convinced to go along with this, but given past experiences remained wary, and only agreed to put 300,000 yuan, around 35,000 USD, into the fund. The early returns on the money looked promising, and so Li Sulan began pressuring him to add more to the fund. He relented and added the remaining 200,000, and Li Sulan was named as the general manager of the account, meaning she had control of any withdrawals. But almost inevitably, the supposed business was little more than a massive fraud in which hundreds of people were involved, and thousands across the country had fallen victim to the scam. In this case, the man behind the scheme was caught and later jailed, but the money defrauded from people who thought they were investors in the wealth management fund was long gone. Just 2 years after Zhao Zuo Hai received compensation for the unjust incarceration, he was left penniless. The properties built for him and the land that came with them had been signed over to his children, leaving him with nothing. Not knowing what else to do, out of desperation Zhao Zuo Hai went back to the Shangqiu government to ask for more compensation. While the local government were fully aware they had responsibility to help, they were concerned if they simply gave him another large check, it was highly likely the money given to him would go the same way. As a result, they would make sure he was taken care of, without having to worry of others taking advantage of him. They found a property in the city for the couple, and agreed to cover the cost of the rent and utility bills for the rest of their lives. The amount ran up to 10,000 yuan, around 1,200 USD a month. It was also decided to give Zhao Zuo Hai regular payments added to his pension, which more than met his daily living costs. Both Zhao Zuo Hai and Li Sulan were offered jobs, which they accepted, Zhao Zuo Hai choosing to become a street cleaner.
人说赵泽海赔给你那些钱，你应该享福了。啥叫享福？吃喝做那不动享福，不是那样。我活动，我自己挣的钱，我吃喝，我上那个活。你说谁是给的再好，你不买点东西，你不给这钱，你就走不掉你。你给这钱，谁都给你，叫你吃，叫你喝，你得挣这个钱得挣来，这是我亲身体会。我拿扫帚一下来，我自己挣的，我吃喝就如是。
Zhao Zuo Hai enjoyed the new job he accepted, and took pride in the fact he was working and earning his own money now. He liked working in the outdoors, and although the environment was very different, it reminded him of happier times when he farmed his land in the village. Li Sulan took a job reading people's water meters and earned extra money selling health supplements from home. While they weren't as wealthy as they were before, they'd be happier with their lives, without the stress of not knowing who to trust, and people trying to take advantage of them. Zhao Zuo Hai eventually had to give up working when health issues which worsened during his time in prison caught up with him. He had high blood pressure, which contributed to him suffering a cerebral infarction. The local government covered the medical bills for his treatment and he went on to recover, but his days working were over. As the years went by, the case would slowly fade from the public's mind, and people paid less attention to Zhao Zuo Hai and Li Sulan. Journalists would visit occasionally to catch up with the couple, and see how their lives were going. They continued to live a simple frugal life, and seemed to be happier away from the public glare, which was especially true of Li Sulan. From the moment she and Zhao Zuo Hai started their relationship, she was cast as an untrustworthy person by family, friends, and to some degree the media who covered the life of Zhao Zuo Hai. There were often suggestions and outright accusations that she was only interested in his money, and that she was a bigamist, still being married to her former husband when she and Zhao Zuo Hai wed.
今天只能听到我说5点了吧？ 他啥子爱好都没有，不爱好鸟，二不好打牌，也不好斗下棋，一没有亲友，二没朋友，亲情朋情啥情都没有，他是一个无情的人。
And while she clearly made mistakes by making bad investments, rather than blaming the predatory con men for taking advantage of two people who didn't have the best level of education and an amount of money they'd never previously come close to having in their lives, many people chose to blame her for losing the money. However, despite the mistrust and accusations, she stayed with Zhao Zuo Hai through everything. When the money was gone, she didn't seek out someone else. When he suffered health problems, she stayed by his side and helped nurse him back to health. She did much more for him than his family or so-called friends who made the accusations about her or came looking for handouts ever did. Unfortunately, most of the bridges burnt between the family and friends of Zhao Zuo Hai and Yi Sulan would never fully be rebuilt. Zhao Zuo Hai eventually began speaking with his eldest son who'd taken money from him. However, they'd only see each other once a year during the spring festival, but Yi Sulan would stay away, still bitter about the conflict between her and the son's wife. Zhao Zuo Hai never returned to the village, having little contact with the people he used to know. Yi Sulan, who'd also fallen out with family members, didn't have much contact with her daughters, as they were still angry about losing money on the scam investments. Not much is known about the life of Zhao Zhenshang after his return from the dead. He stayed away from media attention and isolated himself from others in the village. He always felt it unfair that people blamed him for what happened to Zhao Zuo Hai, arguing the actions of the police were nothing to do with him. He had no interest in giving interviews, and just quietly got on with his life. He never offered Zhao Zuo Hai an apology, nor the third person whose life was damaged because of the incident, Du Jinhui. Her name was smeared around the village, and word of the alleged affair reached her husband. Although the two remained married, they had a long period separated, her husband believing the gossip villagers were spreading. She eventually left the village herself, moving to a new home with her children a few kilometers away. It took a few years, but slowly the relationship with her husband was repaired, and she was happy to never have any contact with Zhao Zhenshang again. The last time the media caught up to Zhao Zuo Hai was in 2019, almost a decade after he was exonerated. He and Yi Sulan were still together, living a quiet, normal life. He told the journalist who visited them that with everything that happened to him over the previous years, he was more than satisfied with his current situation, and that the past felt like little more than a distant bad dream. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.